About 56 million years ago, Earth's global temperature rose 5 degrees over a period of 10,000 years. Change that had significant consequences for all life on Earth.
Most species that lived on this planet are no longer with us. When climate changes, a species has three options. It either adapts to the new conditions, or it moves to a new region where it could find the same kind of environmental conditions and climate, or it will just perish and die out.
The climate change we're in the middle of today is 10 times faster than ever before. But despite the fact that environmental issues are discussed more and more frequently, there are still many who do not understand how important biodiversity is for us, humans, according to biologist Alexandre Antonelli.
We depend on biodiversity for most of the medicines we're using today. All the clothes we're wearing, the wood we are building our houses with. But we also could see biodiversity like an airplane. You could pick out screws from this airplane one at a time and continue for hundreds of times. But at some point, you have taken the last screw that was needed to keep the airplane together, and the whole thing will just crash. We don't know where this threshold is, but we might be coming quite close to it.
So what can we do to slow down this development? Which animals and plants have the greatest need for protection as the climate changes? These are the types of questions that Alex and his team at Gothenburg University are working to answer. They're finding some of these answers in South America.
And this is where I come from, Campinas, in the southeastern part of Brazil. So this is a very important region for me. This is where I was born. This is where I met my wife, who's Swedish, and I was working as a dive master here in the Caribbean. And most of my field work is actually here in Latin America.
The subject that Alex chose to specialize in is called biogeography. With Latin America as his main area, he explores how and why the biological diversity is changing in relationship to time and space.
Which are very helpful to help identifying the species. South America is the perfect place for understanding biogeography. It's extremely species rich. So every time we go there and do field work, we basically find new species and new records for species that were previously known. There are a lot of things still to be found. We are now in the herbarium, which is the university's collection of plants. This specimen is very special because, as you see, it's in a red envelope, and this is called a type specimen. So this is a new species to science, and based on this specimen, we can describe it as a new species and sequence their DNA to see where it came from, who are the closest relatives to the species, and also understand how it evolved through climate change.
Predicting the future is no easy task. But Alex and his colleagues are finding new important clues of what it may look like by identifying winners and losers during the past climate changes.
What we're basically trying to do is to reconstruct the evolutionary history of as many organisms as possible. And we're doing this in two ways. One of them is by looking at the genetic difference among the living organisms. And there are about 7 million species on the planet today.
When comparing the genetic code from two different species of the same group, you will find both similarities and differences. The greater the difference in DNA, the more time has passed since they went separate ways from a common ancestor. In this way, one can determine the time and identify crucial evolutionary moments. Moments when new species were created while others died out.
So by doing this, we can also understand under which circumstances they evolved. So for instance, was climate warmer when this group of organisms evolved, or was it cooler?
But we can only look at the DNA from living species. Scientists estimate that 99.99% of all animals and plants that have ever existed on Earth are now extinct. And in order to understand what has happened to an ecosystem, it is important to take into account all species, both past and present. So they are also looking at fossils.
Some fossils, they can tell us a lot about how the environment looked like in the past. So this fossil is actually here from Sweden. It's about 400 million years ago, and it's a cephalopod, which is only found in tropical waters, meaning that the whole of Sweden was actually in a tropical zone about 400 million years ago. By tracing the evolutionary history, we can find out when different organisms evolved, who are their closest relatives, and where they come from. And we are doing that for as many species as possible, trying to really reconstruct the tree of life of all living organisms.
It is like putting a gigantic puzzle together and only having access to some of the pieces. But every year, the researchers are finding new species, and the picture of how they have evolved through history is becoming clearer. And even an incomplete picture can give important pointers on how the biological diversity can best be protected in the future.
We know from our evolutionary studies that species which are more generalists, so those that don't necessarily rely on a single pollinator or a single source of food, they usually do better than others which are very specialists. We cannot save all single species or all habitats around the planet. We have to prioritize. And the way we're doing this is to try and locate regions of particular importance because they have most genetic variation, for instance, or most functional variation. But we have to consider that when climate comes and changes, the species might need to move to, for instance, a higher place when it gets warmer. So basically, if you have a nature reserve with a moose or a lion that needs to move to somewhere else, there'll be roads and cities and industries not linking those different nature reserves. So creating corridors and interconnected protected areas is really a major step in terms of protecting biodiversity for the future.